She had rehearsed the words 1,000 times. Standing before the tall, frost-laced window of Wyndmere Hall, her fingers laced so tightly together that the knuckles had gone white as fresh-fallen snow, Lady Elara Ashford had whispered those words to the cold glass, to the silver birch trees shivering in the November wind, to the indifferent grey sky that pressed down upon the Derbyshire moors like a lid sealed upon a coffin. She had said them to the flickering candle on the writing desk. She had said them to her own pale reflection. But she had never said them to him. Until tonight. The library of Wyndmere Hall was a cathedral of mahogany and shadow. 12 feet of bookshelves lined every wall, their leather-bound spines gleaming faintly in the amber light of a fire that had been burning since late afternoon. The room smelled of old paper, of beeswax, of cedarwood smoke, and beneath it all, beneath everything, the faint, cold scent of winter that crept perpetually through the stone walls of the hall, as though the manor itself were exhaling. Edmund Hale, the 8th Duke of Wyndmere, stood with his back to her. He was always standing with her back to her these days. He was tall, extraordinarily so, with shoulders that filled the cut of his dark evening coat with the precision of a man who had been sculpted rather than born. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and in the firelight Elara could trace the hard, uncompromising line of his jaw, the faintest tension in the muscles beneath his ear, the way his hand gripped the crystal glass of brandy as though it were the only fixed point in an unsteady world. She had loved him for 3 years. She had been married to him for 8 months, and she was not entirely certain he knew her at all. "Edmund," she said, and her voice, to her profound dismay, came out steadier than she felt. It was the voice of a woman performing composure, not possessing it. He turned slowly, with that economy of motion that was so peculiarly his, a man who had learned early and at great cost never to waste a movement. His dark hair, dark as the November sky beyond the window, settled upon her face, and for a moment, just a breath, something flickered within them, something almost tender, something that reminded her with painful acuity of the man she had glimpsed on their wedding night, when he had pressed his lips to her temple and whispered words so quiet she had not been entirely certain she had heard them at all. "You look unwell," he said. It was not unkind. With Edmund nothing was precisely unkind. It was simply insufficient. "I am perfectly well," which was not entirely the truth, but neither was it a lie. She was not ill. She was terrified, which was a different matter altogether. She took one step toward him, and then another, the silk of her evening gown whispering against the Turkish carpet, the candlelight catching the pale gold of her hair and setting it aglow like a halo she had done nothing to deserve. "I have something to tell you, Edmund, something rather consequential." His expression did not change, but she saw his hand tighten almost imperceptibly around the crystal glass. He had the face of a man who had anticipated bad news for so long that he had learned to preemptively compose himself against it. "Then tell me," he said, simply, and so she did. "I am with child, Edmund." The silence that followed was extraordinary in its completeness. The fire crackled. The wind moaned softly against the window panes. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the great house, a clock began to chime the hour, 8 hollow strokes that rang through the stone corridors like a funeral bell. And then the glass left his hand. It did not slip, it was not dropped, it was hurled, propelled with sudden and absolute violence against the stone face of the hearth, and it exploded in a cascade of glittering shards and amber liquid, and the sound of it was so shocking, so utterly at odds with the quiet, controlled man she had come to know in 8 months of marriage, that Elara flinched backward as though she had been struck. "I cannot have children." He said it the way a man announces a verdict. Not with anger now. The anger had gone with the glass, spent in that single violent instant. What remained in his voice was something far more devastating. It was certainty, cold, unyielding, absolute certainty. Elara stared at him. The firelight danced between them. A single shard of crystal caught the flame and threw a brief, brilliant spark against the ceiling. "I beg your pardon," she whispered. "I cannot have children." He repeated it without inflection, without cruelty, without anything at all, as though he were reciting a passage from one of the encyclopedias that lined the shelves above his head. It is a medical certainty. I was told as much 11 years ago by the finest physician in London. It is the reason my father's estate was entailed as it was. It is the reason—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "It is simply not possible." For a long moment Elara could not speak. She stood in the great library of Wyndmere Hall in the flickering amber dark, and she understood, with terrible shattering clarity, precisely what he was implying, and the understanding broke something inside her that she was not certain could ever be wholly repaired. "You cannot mean—" Her voice fractured. She pressed her fingers to her lips, gathering herself, because she was an Ashford, and Ashfords did not crumble in the face of accusation, not in front of witnesses, and most certainly not in front of the men who accused them. "Edmund, look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were dark and shuttered and remote, the eyes of a man who had sealed every door within himself and thrown away the key. "I have not been unfaithful to you," she said. "I have never, in all my life, in all my dealings, in every private and public moment since the day I was born, I have never been unfaithful to anyone. I am telling you that I carry your child. I do not know how you reconcile that with whatever you were told 11 years ago, but I am telling you the truth." He said nothing. That silence, that cold, impenetrable silence, was worse than anything he might have said. Elara turned and she walked from the room, and she did not look back, because if she had looked back and found his expression unchanged, she was quite certain it would have destroyed her entirely. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the great four-poster bed of her chambers, staring up at the canopy of ivory silk above her, listening to the wind strip the last of the autumn leaves from the great oak outside her window, and she pressed one hand very gently against the slight, secret warmth of her abdomen, and she thought about the 8 months of her marriage with a clarity that sleeplessness sometimes grants. She thought about Edmund as she had first known him, at the Pemberton ball 3 years past, when she was 20, and largely unimpressed by the procession of eligible gentlemen her mother had paraded before her that season. She had been standing beside a potted palm, eating a stolen macaroon, and reading a pamphlet she had hidden inside her program, when a voice directly beside her said, very quietly, "The one on the left is by Voltaire. I should perhaps warn you that it becomes rather scandalous in the 3rd chapter." She looked up, startled into the darkest pair of eyes she had ever encountered on a human face. He had not been smiling precisely, but there had been something in the corners of his mouth, some reluctant, carefully suppressed warmth that had made her think he wanted to. She said, "I am aware. I am currently in the 4th chapter." And he looked at her with an expression that she would later come to recognize as the highest compliment Edmund Hale was capable of paying. He had looked at her as though she had surprised him. They had spoken for 40 minutes, tucked behind the potted palm, while the orchestra played and the candles burned low. And by the end of those 40 minutes, Elara had understood that she was in a very great deal of difficulty. She had fallen in love, which was inconvenient. She had fallen in love with a duke, which was, by her mother's reckoning, an exceptional achievement. She had fallen in love with Edmund Hale specifically, which was complicated, because Edmund Hale was not a man who let people in. She had sensed it from the very beginning, like feeling a wall in the dark, knowing it was there by the faint pressure against your outstretched hands before you ever touched the stone. He was charming in his quiet and particular way. He was learned and sometimes funny, and occasionally given to acts of such unexpected, undemonstrative generosity that they pierced her directly to the center of her chest. But he kept something back, always, some essential innermost part of himself that he guarded with the ferocity of a man protecting the last thing he loved. She had thought, in the reckless optimism of a young woman newly in love, that time would remedy this. 8 months of marriage had taught her that time alone was insufficient.
that the wall Edmund had built around himself was not constructed from bad temper or selfishness or ordinary masculine reserve. It had been built, stone by careful stone, from something much older and much darker. From grief, she thought, in the small hours of that November night, from some wound so old it had calcified into architecture. She did not yet know the shape of that wound, but she was beginning to suspect that she needed to, rather urgently. She found him in the stables at dawn. This surprised her. Edmund was not, as a rule, an early riser. He was a man of late nights and later mornings, of books read by candlelight and fires kept burning until 3 in the morning. Finding him in the stables at first light, his coat discarded despite the biting cold, his shirt-sleeves rolled to the elbows as he worked a brush along the flank of his grey gelding, was sufficiently remarkable that she stopped in the stable doorway and simply looked at him for a moment. He had not slept either. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, that particular bone-deep exhaustion that looks from a distance almost identical to stoicism. "Edmund," she said. He did not startle. He simply stilled, the brush hovering over the horse's flank, and then, very slowly, he turned. In the grey morning light, stripped of the amber glamour of firelight and evening dress, he looked different, younger somehow, and far more fragile, though she suspected he would have found the observation mortifying. There were shadows beneath his eyes, his jaw was unshaved. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the night making a very difficult decision and was not entirely at peace with the conclusion he had reached. "I owe you an apology," he said, before she could speak. It was so unexpected that for a moment she simply stood and absorbed it. "I acted with great discourtesy last night," and the words came out carefully, precisely, as though he had rehearsed them. "The glass was inexcusable. My words—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, painful and unguarded. "My words were worse." "Yes," she said, because she was not in the business of false comfort, and he deserved honesty more than he deserved absolution. "I do not know how to explain to you." He set down the brush. He turned fully toward her, and for the first time in 8 months of marriage, Elara Hale had the distinct impression that her husband was about to let her see something true. "I was told when I was 19 years old that I could not father children. It was the consequence of a fever, a violent one. The physician was very certain. My father was—" His voice thinned. "My father was devastated. He had hoped for a dynasty. He got instead a single son who could not perpetuate it." Elara waited. The grey gelding shifted softly beside them. Cold morning air moved through the stable, smelling of hay and horse and frost.
"I have carried that certainty for 11 years, Edmund said. "It has shaped every decision I have made. It was the primary reason I resisted—" He stopped again, and this time the pause was longer, and when he continued, his voice had changed in a way she could not quite name. "It was the reason I resisted feeling anything for anyone, because what manner of man traps a woman in a marriage with no heir, no nursery, no future? What manner of man asks a woman to choose that?" "You might have told me," Elara said softly. "Before our betrothal, you might have told me and let me choose." "I know." The word landed between them with the weight of 11 years of regret. "I know. I was a coward. I told myself it was noble, protecting you from the knowledge. But the truth," his voice roughened, "the truth is that I could not bear for you to choose against me, which is, I recognize, entirely selfish." Elara looked at him for a long, still moment. She thought about choices, about the ones she had made, and the ones that had been made for her, and the ones that yet remained. She thought about the small, fierce, determined life that was, even now, beginning its long journey into the world, entirely indifferent to its parents' complications. "Elara," she said very quietly, "physicians are not infallible." He looked at her. "They are learned men, and I would not dream of diminishing the significance of what you were told. But learned men have been wrong before. 11 years is a long time, and the evidence, she allowed herself just barely the ghost of a smile, the evidence would rather seem to argue against certainty. Something shifted in his face. It was like watching a door open, slowly, painfully, with the particular resistance of hinges long disused. "You are telling me the truth," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have never told you anything else," she replied. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and then his hands were on her face, both of them, cupped with extraordinary gentleness around her cheeks, and he was looking at her in an expression she had never seen on his face before, not in 3 years of acquaintance and 8 months of marriage, not in 100 evenings in 100 candle-lit rooms. He looked terrified. He looked astonished. He looked, beneath both of those things, like a man who has waited a very long time to feel something, and is alarmed and overwhelmed and desperately grateful to have finally arrived. "Elara," he said. Just that. Just her name. "Elara," she said, and she covered his hands with her own and held them there against her face, warm in the cold morning air. "We are going to have to talk about a great many things." "Yes," he said, "we are. Starting, I think, with the complete and unconditional sharing of consequential information on both sides." The ghost of a smile crossed his face, that same reluctant, carefully suppressed warmth she had seen behind the potted palm 3 years and a lifetime ago. "That seems," he said, "entirely reasonable." The months that followed were not simple. Love, real love, the kind built in the aftermath of hurt and misunderstanding, never proceeds simply. It proceeds haltingly, with false starts and doubling back, with the occasional evening where old wounds reopen and old silences descend, and the 2 people involved must choose, again and again, to turn toward one another rather than away.
Edmund chose. Every time. It was the thing that astonished her most about him, this man who had spent 11 years learning to retreat, who had built his walls so high and so thick that she had sometimes feared they were permanent features of his character rather than learned defenses. When given the choice, when offered the genuine possibility of intimacy and its attendant vulnerability, he chose it, not easily, not without cost, but with a consistency that was, in its own quiet way, extraordinary. He told her, in fragments and over many evenings, about the fever, about his father's cold and measured disappointment, about the young woman he had briefly loved at 22, whom he had released without explanation, an act he had believed to be generous, and had since come to understand was merely a way of avoiding the conversation he could not bear to have. Elara listened. She did not offer false reassurance. She did not minimize or deflect. She simply listened, which was, as it turned out, the thing he had needed for 11 years and never known how to ask for. And she told him, in return, about her own fears, about the loneliness of their early marriage, the magnificent hollow loneliness of living alongside a man you loved who would not let you near him, about the nights she had sat in this very library, running her fingers along the spines of his books, reading the marginalia he left in pencil in the narrow margins, learning him that way, through the thoughts he committed to paper when he believed no one was watching. "You read my annotations," he said, and she could not tell whether he was appalled or moved. "All of them," she said, serenely. "You have very strong opinions about Aristotle." "Aristotle was frequently wrong," he said, with the first fully unguarded laugh she had ever heard from him, and the sound of it filled the library like warmth fills a room when someone finally, mercifully lights the fire. She was delivered of a son on a Tuesday evening in March, when the Derbyshire countryside was just beginning to remember what green looked like, and the last of the winter's snow had retreated to the shadowed hollows of the moors. Edmund did not leave the house. He paced the corridor outside her chambers for 6 hours with a thoroughness that his valet later described in hushed and reverent tones as absolutely unprecedented in a man of his customary restraint.
He wore a path in the carpet. He read the same page of the same book 17 times and retained nothing. He sent for tea he did not drink and refused food he did not eat. And when, at last, the door opened and the midwife placed in his arms a small, red, furious, entirely perfect person, when Edmund Hale looked down at his son for the very first time, every person present in that corridor subsequently reported that his face did something they had no adequate words to describe. He came to her afterward with the baby still in his arms and sat beside her on the bed, and they both looked at the small face between them, and neither of them spoke for a very long time. "Hello," Edmund said, at last, in a voice barely above a whisper. He was speaking to his son, but he reached out and took Elara's hand with the surety of a man who intends to hold on indefinitely. "Hello. We have been very much looking forward to meeting you."
Elara turned her head to look at her husband. He was looking at the baby with an expression of such complete and undefended wonder that it made her chest ache with something enormous, not sorrow, though it was adjacent to sorrow, something for which she had never quite found the right word. Gratitude, perhaps. The specific, acute gratitude of a woman who has waited for someone to be brave enough to love her, and has, against all reasonable expectation, found that he was. "Edmund," she said softly. He looked at her. "We are going to be all right, you know," she said. He looked at her and at their son and at the room around them, the fire burning low in the grate, the last light of the March evening falling golden through the curtains, the great old house settling around them with the particular creaks and sighs of a place that has housed many generations and is, perhaps, already making ready for the next. "Yes," said Edmund Hale, the 8th Duke of Wyndmere, who had been told he could not have children, and had lived for 11 years in the long shadow of that verdict, and who held now in his arms the living, breathing, furiously squirming proof that some certainties are merely the beginning of a longer story. "Yes," he said again, and he brought Elara's hand to his lips and held it there. "I rather think we are." Some walls, built in grief and guarded with pride, come down not with force, but with the patient, particular courage of a woman who refuses to stop believing in what lies behind them. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, on the other side of those walls, there is not ruin, but a room full of firelight and a man who has been waiting for a very long time to finally be found. Thank you for listening to the Duke's Lost Letters. If this story moved you, do not forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share with someone who loves a romance that earns its happy ending.